The cameras didn't miss a second Barron Trump hurling a vicious insult at Jasmine Crockett in front of millions. She didn't scream, she didn't stumble, she answered with the law, filing a $50 million lawsuit that shook the Capitol. This is no ordinary lawsuit, it's a fight over dignity, race, and the soul of American democracy. Will the law finally make an empire bow before the truth? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The United States Capitol trembled under blinding white lights, cameras circling like predators as a single headline burned above the dais: free speech and family power in American democracy. The chamber was overflowing, every seat filled, millions of Americans watching live, waiting for blood. Silence cut sharper than any blade. This was no routine hearing, this was war. At one table sat Jasmine Crockett, the young black congresswoman from Texas, once a civil rights lawyer who fought in courtrooms where the odds were always against her. Her stare was unflinching, her red folder resting like dynamite on the desk. She was not just present, she was armed with truth, ready to strike. Across from her lounged Barron Trump, the last heir of the dynasty arms, folded face carved in arrogance. He smirked as if the entire chamber belonged to him. Dynasty versus defiance, bloodline versus backbone, and tonight, under the eyes of a nation, only one would walk out unbroken. Trump leaned forward, seizing the microphone before anyone else could breathe. He did not speak of policy, not of law, not of governance. Instead, his eyes cut across the chamber and locked onto Jasmine Crockett. He let them travel from her shoes to her face, pausing just long enough for the cameras to capture the disdain. And then, with the arrogance of someone who thought power was his birthright, he struck. Congress once belonged to great families, Barron spat, his voice dripping with contempt. But now we allow the descendants of maids and janitors to sit as equals. It is a disgrace to the Trump bloodline and an insult to the history of America. The words echoed against the marble walls, heavy, deliberate, cruel. Gasps rippled through the chamber like a sudden storm. Reporters froze mid-note. The insult was not hidden in nuance. It was naked, vicious, undeniable. But he was not done. Barron leaned back, his smirk widening, and fired again. Crockett's blood will never be clean enough to touch this table of power. She is nothing more than the cheap product of a failed class, and her very presence here is a tragic accident in this nation's history. The venom in his tone turned the chamber into a battlefield. One senator covered his mouth in disbelief. Another stared down at the floor, unwilling to meet the cameras. Every lens in the room snapped toward Jasmine. The shot was perfect, her face calm, but her eyes blazing like sharpened steel. In her hand, the pen trembled, not from fear, but from pressure gripped so tightly it could have snapped. She did not speak. She did not move. She sat in silence, but the silence itself roared. And in that silence, the nation knew something far bigger than a hearing had just begun. The chamber was still vibrating from Barron's insult when Jasmine finally rose. The movement was calm, deliberate, yet it sliced through the silence like a blade. Her voice rang out steady and sharp, each syllable landing with weight. Barron, I am the daughter of workers. That is what gives me strength, the kind of strength you will never understand. The words thundered across the marble walls, turning the hearing room into a stage of reckoning. She placed her hand on the red folder, the cameras zooming in as if the nation itself held its breath. Slowly she opened it, flipping a few pages with precision, but keeping their contents hidden. The sight was electric, an image already destined to become iconic played on loop by CNN and MSNBC. Jasmine, standing tall, folder glowing like dynamite under the lights. The moment screamed of power, restrained of a storm waiting to break. When she spoke again, her voice was firm, commanding a strike against arrogance itself. Free speech does not give anyone the right to systemic humiliation. I will not respond with heavy words. I will let the law of the United States answer for me. The chamber froze, every camera locked on her face, every senator stunned by the clarity of her defiance. Barron leaned back in his chair, smirking, a dry laugh slipping from his lips. He believed she was bluffing, that her words carried no weight. But millions watching across the nation felt it differently. They saw the steel in her eyes, the promise in her silence, and they knew a battle far beyond words had just begun. The silence of the hearing had barely faded when the nation woke to shockwaves. Jasmine Crockett stepped in front of the cameras, the world waiting for her next move. The reporter's questions collided in the air, but she raised her hand and silence fell. Her voice cut clean, steady, and fierce. Today I have officially filed a lawsuit against Barron Trump in the federal court of Washington, D.C. I am seeking $50 million in damages for defamation. His words were not free speech. They were an attack on my dignity, on my family, and on every worker in this country who has ever been told they are less than. The words hit like a lightning strike, and the crowd outside erupted in gasps and shouts. Jasmine continued, her tone heavy with fire. Let me be clear, this case is not about politics. This is about justice. The law of the United States will decide, and the truth will carry its price, $50 million. Reporters scribbled frantically as cameras zoomed in her red folder once again in her hand, now transformed into the symbol of a battle that could alter history. The courthouse behind her became the backdrop of defiance, and America realized the fight had moved from words to law. On CNN, the breaking banner screamed across the screen, "Crockett sues Barron Trump for $50 million." Analysts leaned forward, eyes wide, dissecting the lawsuit in real time. This is not just a filing, one expert said. This could define the very boundaries of the First Amendment. MSNBC echoed the urgency. This case could redraw the line between protected speech and systemic humiliation. Their voices shook with the weight of what was unfolding, as if they knew history was being written in the courtroom as much as in Congress. Fox News pushed back their hosts, sneering at Jasmine's words, calling it a political circus. But even conservative voices cracked under the weight of Barron's insult. One seasoned pundit admitted on air, Barron's words were brutal. Even for politics, they may be too poisonous to hide behind free speech. For the first time, cracks appeared in the dynasty's shield. The arrogance of inherited power now faced the grinding force of the American legal system. Across the nation, the divide was instant and ferocious. To some, Jasmine was a warrior, a champion of the working class, daring to strike back against generations of privilege. To others, she was a climber, a political opportunist, chasing the Trump name for gain. In diners, schools, and factories, debates turned into arguments, arguments into shouting. Jasmine's lawsuit had turned the nation's living rooms into battlegrounds. Outside the Capitol, the streets became an arena of voices. Protesters flooded the steps with banners and chants. One side raised signs that read, "Truth has a price, $50 million." The other side countered with, "Don't silence America." Their voices collided in the air, thunderous, raw, unyielding. The crowd became a mirror of the country itself, split, furious, electrified. And as Jasmine's words echoed across every screen, every network, and every home, it became clear this was no empty threat. The lawsuit was real, and America was bracing for a war not just of politics, but of law, truth, and survival. The lawsuit had been filed, and now the real battlefield shifted to the federal court in Washington, D.C. The courthouse stood like a fortress as the eyes of the world locked on its steps. Reporters from every major network crowded the sidewalks, their microphones raised like weapons, broadcasting every detail to millions across the globe. Outside, the protest lines roared, two camps split by ideology and rage. One side shouted for justice, the other for free speech, their chants clashing in the air like steel against steel. Through the chaos came Barron Trump, flanked by a wall of attorneys in dark suits. His chin lifted, his expression carved in arrogance, as if the storm around him was nothing but noise. Cameras flashed, capturing his forced composure, the smirk that barely hid the tension beneath. Moments later, Jasmine Crockett appeared, greeted by cheers that rolled through the crowd like thunder. Supporters waved signs and applause echoed as she walked with calm defiance, the red folder in her hand, once again glowing like a symbol of war. Inside, the tension snapped into silence as the judge struck the gavel. His voice carried across the chamber. This is not merely a personal lawsuit. This is a trial that will test the boundary between free speech and human dignity in a democracy. The words froze the air and every camera turned. Across America, households held their breath, knowing the battle had truly begun. The courtroom was electric, the silence so sharp it could cut when Barron's lead attorney rose. He smoothed his tie, looked straight at the judge, and declared, "This is politics. Harsh words, even cruel words, fall under the First Amendment. Free speech in America has always allowed sharp tongues in the political arena. His voice carried confidence, almost smug, as though the law itself was his shield. Cameras zoomed in, capturing every syllable, and across the nation, millions watched, waiting for the counterstrike. Then Jasmine Crockett stood. Her presence commanded the room before she spoke a single word. She looked at the judge, then at the jury, and said firmly, "No, this is not politics. This is systemic defamation. The First Amendment does not protect deliberate humiliation aimed at my heritage and my dignity." There is a line between political speech and personal destruction, and Barron Trump crossed it. Her tone was steady, but every sentence landed like a punch. She held up a page from her folder, her voice ringing with precision. "Let me remind this court of the landmark case New York Times against Sullivan, 1964. That decision drew a critical distinction. It protected free debate on public issues, yes, but it also recognized that reckless or malicious falsehoods are not shielded. Political speech has protection. Targeted defamation of an individual's identity does not. And today, this court must uphold that difference. The words echoed like a gavel, impossible to ignore. Reporters scribbled furiously. Commentators whispered into live microphones. The phrase "trial of the century" began flashing across news tickers within minutes. And as Jasmine lowered the page back into her folder, the courtroom knew this was not just a defense. It was the opening strike in a legal war that could redefine free speech itself. The courtroom was silent when Jasmine's attorney stepped forward, the red folder under her arm. She paused, let the weight of anticipation fill the air, then turned to the judge. "Your Honor," she said, "we submit into evidence an email written by the defendant to a close friend." The overhead screen flickered to life, and there it was, projected in stark black letters. "Crockett is trash, dirty blood. Congress does not need people like her." Gasps rippled through the chamber like a wave. Some jurors shifted in their seats, others fixed their eyes on Barron Trump. Reporters scrambled pens, scratching furiously, while cameras zoomed in on the line that now blazed across the screen. The attorney added calmly, "Metadata from the defendant's personal server confirms this email is authentic. The forensic report verifies its origin without doubt." Barron stiffened in his chair, his jaw tightening. His lawyers whispered frantically, flipping through papers, but the blow had already landed. Jasmine sat motionless, her eyes locked on the words that had been weaponized against her. The gallery behind her murmured in shock, a low thunder rising until the judge banged the gavel for order. For the first time in the trial, Barron looked unsettled, his smirk gone, replaced by the strain of exposure. But Jasmine's team was not finished. The attorney's voice cut sharp. "This was not a single lapse. This is a pattern of contempt." The screen shifted again, this time showing a transcript from a fundraising event in 2022. The words rang out, the recording clear. "That Newark kid will never be big enough to dream about the presidency." The name attached Senator Cory Booker. The room erupted with whispers, a few audible gasps punctuating the air. Booker's reputation and long-standing career made the insult sting twice as hard. The image of his face displayed alongside the quote sent the gallery into uproar. The attorney raised her hand for silence, then displayed the next slide. It was a social media post captured and archived before deletion. The words appeared in bold letters, "An old black woman who cannot read." The caption identified the target representative, Sheila Jackson Lee of Texas. The reaction was immediate: boos, shouts, and cries of outrage from the audience. Even seasoned journalists shook their heads, stunned at the brutality of the remark. The judge called for quiet again, his gavel striking harder this time, but the damage was clear. And then came the third strike. The attorney pressed a button, and the speakers filled the courtroom with a secret recording. Barron's voice, unmistakable, played over the air. "Jeffries is nothing but a shadow for the white bosses." The words hung in the air like poison. The caption glowed on the screen: House Democratic Leader Hakeem Jeffries. The jury leaned forward. Some members of the gallery rose halfway to their feet in disbelief. It was no longer possible to argue this was accidental. The pattern was undeniable. The attorney closed the sequence with finality. "This is not one slip of the tongue. This is systematic defamation aimed repeatedly at black leaders. The evidence proves a history, not an accident." On the screen, three faces appeared side by side. Booker, Jackson, Lee, Jeffries beneath them, a single line in stark letters: not a lapse, a system. The chamber exploded with noise, shouts, gasps, frantic reporters rushing out to deliver breaking news. Barron sat frozen, trapped by his own words. The nation watching knew the story had just shifted forever. The evidence still hung in the air when the judge returned, robes sweeping as the gallery fell silent. He raised the decision, voice clear, the gavel ready. "This court finds the defendant liable for defamation," he said. "The record shows a sustained pattern of targeted humiliation. The claim is proven to a legal certainty." The gavel cracked down. Damages are awarded in the amount of $50 million. A shock wave moved through the chamber. Murmurs, gasps, the scrape of chairs as reporters lunged for the aisle. Barron Trump rose too quickly, then steadied himself, color drained, jaw locked. Cameras detonated in bursts as marshals cleared a lane. "Mr. Trump, do you have a comment? Will you appeal?" The questions pelted him like rain. He kept his eyes on the floor, shoulder to shoulder with attorneys slipping past microphones as if they were tripwires. Outside, he ducked into a black SUV, the door slamming on a storm he could no longer control. The courthouse steps became a stage as Jasmine Crockett stepped to the microphones, the red folder under her arm like a banner. Flash bulbs strobed. The crowd pressed forward. The air felt charged and thin. She looked straight into the cameras and spoke each word clean as steel. "He thought I was lesser because of my background and my skin. But today I proved that justice does not recognize bloodlines. Truth and dignity carry a price of $50 million. The sentence landed and the plaza erupted. Cheers, tears, a single roar that rolled across the stone. Jasmine held her ground, the folder still closed, the verdict speaking louder than anything inside it. Newsrooms snapped into motion, producing headlines like artillery. On the screens inside taxi cabs and living rooms, lower thirds blazed, verdict $50 million. By dusk, the image was everywhere. Jasmine on the marble steps, chin lifted, red folder bright against the gray day. The New York Times ran the photo above the fold. The Washington Post cut in with a banner. The BBC led its homepage with the same shot, a single caption, "Beneath defamation case rocks U.S. politics." Commentators called it accountability, a line finally drawn. The gavel had fallen and the country felt it. By nightfall, the verdict had already burst beyond the courthouse and into kitchens, union halls, barber shops, and church basements across America. In the working districts, people played the clip again and again, watching Jasmine on the steps with the red folder like a flag. "She speaks for us," a cafeteria worker said, wiping her hands on an apron as the news scrolled by. A mechanic in a grease-stained shirt nodded at the screen and whispered, "Finally, someone told the bloodlines that a paycheck has dignity." In the pews that evening, a pastor lifted his voice. "Words can wound, but law can bind the wound." And the congregation answered with a single, rising amen. The response inside black neighborhoods felt like current through copper, hot and direct. "We saw ourselves in her," a grandmother told a reporter outside a grocery store, pointing at the headline, about $50 million. A high school senior clutched his debate notebook and said, "If the rules can protect her, they can protect me." On the corner, a barber clicked off his clippers to hear the replay of Jasmine's statement, word for word. A marching band practicing 2 blocks away broke into cheers when the drum major shouted, "Dignity is on the board today." Union halls flickered with television light as stewards drew chalk lines on whiteboards. "A verdict like this changes leverage," a steward told the room, tapping the word dignity 3 times. "It tells every workplace bully that a smear can carry a price." In a packaging plant, supervisors lowered the volume and then turned it back up because the crew demanded the sound. "Let it play," a forklift driver said. Justice doesn't need subtitles. By the next morning, law schools were already revising syllabi with a speed usually reserved for emergencies. A dean sent a memo titled, "Crockett Decision, Free Speech, and Defamation, a New Teaching Moment." Professors drafted modules pairing New York Times against Sullivan with the fresh opinion to illustrate the line between public debate and targeted humiliation. A flyer appeared on a bulletin board, "Emergency Colloquium, When Speech Becomes a Weapon, Lessons from Crockett." Registration hit capacity in an hour, with students dragging extra chairs down the hall. In a packed first-year lecture, a professor wrote 3 phrases on the board: "Public figure, actual malice, systemic pattern," and turned to the class. "Where does the First Amendment stop And where does accountability begin? She asked, letting the silence grow. A student raised a hand. If speech aims at identity instead of ideas, the Constitution's shield thins. Another countered. But politics is sharp by nature. Which edge is too sharp? The professor nodded, then cued the clip of Jasmine's counsel walking the court through metadata chain of custody and intent. Moot court teams seized the moment like sprinters at a gunshot. One side argued that robust debate demands heat. The other mapped a trail from insult to injury using the opinion's findings. Context is king, but pattern is crown. A student advocate said, eliciting a murmur from the gallery. Judges pressed, show us the threshold where critique turns to character annihilation. When the round ended, a visiting justice leaned into the microphone and said, take note, this is how doctrine grows teeth. Meanwhile, Barron became a cautionary slide in presentations from civics classrooms to corporate trainings. Editorial cartoons pictured an heir carrying a crown melted into a muzzle, the caption reading, arrogance at market price. Donors quietly backed away statements framed as scheduling conflicts and strategic reassessments. Strategists, who once spoke of inevitability, began using new words, risk exposure, volatility. In living rooms where dynasties were once treated like weather people now said, he is the example an arrogant, failed generation wearing yesterday's entitlement. Cable panels hammered the theme until it was steel. This was not a gag order on ideas, a constitutional scholar told a host tapping the desk. This was a bill for targeted humiliation, itemized and stamped. A former ethics counsel added, the lesson is basic. If you brand a person's blood as dirt, do not expect the Constitution to launder it. Editors ran side-by-side spreads Jasmine with the red folder, the verdict text, and a timeline of conduct that made the number make sense. The story felt less like a scandal and more like a standard finally enforced. Community centers filled for town halls that sounded like revival meetings crossed with seminars. A teacher stood and said, words cut my students daily. Today they saw a bandage made of law. A nurse shared, I have heard slurs in waiting rooms. Now I can name the harm and point to a remedy. A teenage poet read, dignity is not a rumor, and the room answered with applause that rolled and rolled. Afterward, a small scholarship fund for debate and civics in the neighborhood hit its modest goal by midnight. In boardrooms, HR directors updated slides with a new page titled, Accountability Beyond Policy. Intent matters, pattern matters, and audience matters, one said, drawing concentric circles that ended at liability. A senior manager asked, is this just politics? The counsel shook her head. No, this is about dignity, not doctrine. The verdict did not tax ideas, it taxed contempt. An executive closed his notebook and said, consider the message received. Through it all, Jasmine's image on the marble steps kept returning as if the nation needed a still frame to anchor its turbulence. She did not gloat in the photograph. She stood steady, the red folder under her arm like a covenant. A city bus rumbled past with the front page taped in the driver's window, a quiet declaration between routes. In a small diner, someone stuck the photo to the pie case with blue tape, and customers took turns reading the caption out loud. He thought I was lesser, a waitress repeated softly, but law spoke louder. By week's end, the message had crystallized into something that could be taught, quoted, and carried. Words have the power to destroy reputations, careers, hope, and the simple belief that a person belongs. The case etched that truth in clear lines. Yet justice, when it wakes and does its work, can convert poison into precedent, injury into compensation, and a slur into a lesson printed in bold. $50 million was not a number shouted in anger. It was a ledger entry in a public book that everyone could read. The figure stood there like a lighthouse warning ships that had sailed too long by the stars of entitlement. So the communities who had waited for a sign treated her as one not for perfection, but for proof. Law schools folded the decision into their bones. Professors began sentences with her name the way earlier generations began them with famous cases. Barron's story entered classrooms as the example: you draw a red line under power, without compass, speech without conscience, a dynasty mistaking volume for virtue. And in the everyday places where America remembers itself, shops, buses, kitchens, pews, the lesson: settled words can be weapons, but justice can disarm them and present the bill. $50 million was the price, and the country for once understood the math. By the next morning, the verdict had a name that stuck to every screen and front page. News producers said it first in the control rooms, then anchors repeated it with a cadence that felt like a drumline. The $50 million truth battle. The phrase traveled from chyrons to headlines to morning push alerts, turning a courtroom decision into a cultural landmark. Editorial boards framed the number as a measure, not a spectacle proof, that dignity could be counted and that contempt could be invoiced. Commentators replayed the gavel, the steps the red folder, and the sentence that broke like thunder. The country understood the label because it captured the thing plainly, a fight over truth priced and paid. On the Hill, the echo from the courthouse crossed the river and walked into committee rooms. Senior members called emergency sessions to sketch the outlines of a bill aimed at curbing defamatory speech in campaign settings and official forums. "We will not criminalize dissent. We will civilize discourse," one sponsor said, drawing a sharp line for the cameras before slipping into negotiations. Staffers pinned whiteboards with phrases like clear, targeted, malicious, and circled thresholds that could survive constitutional scrutiny. Lobbyists argued that politics needed room to breathe while victims needed room to heal, and the draft language began to balance both lungs. By week's end, a working title leaked: the Public Dignity and Democratic Speech Act, a mouthful built to hold the weight of a new boundary. Abroad, the story lit up newsrooms that usually treat American drama like recurring weather. London broadsheets ran think pieces comparing the verdict to Dominion versus Fox 2023, calling both moments pressure tests for the cost of false and corrosive speech. In Toronto, commentators said the price tag felt less like punishment than calibration, a rebar reinforcement poured into a sagging column. Nairobi's Evening News asked whether the American line would travel to younger democracies where slurs sometimes pass for policy. In Seoul, a legal panel mapped the American cases on a split screen, tracing how precedent grows spine when harm grows teeth. The verdict, they said, did what global law often attempts and rarely completes it: turned a cultural injury into a measurable consequence. Meanwhile, Jasmine's face steady, direct frame by the courthouse steps, became the image that millions saved printed and taped to walls. Student groups invited her to speak, then had to move events to gymnasiums because the sign-up swelled beyond fire code. "Courage is a decision you make before the fear arrives," she told one audience. And the line traveled through campuses like a password. Young women, especially young black women, repeated the phrasing to each other in texts on lockers and notes passed during lectures: "Courage first, fear later." Civil rights clinics quoted her filings to teach strategy. Debate captains quoted her statement to teach spine. In a space that often demands survival before speech, she showed speech that created survival. Barron, by contrast, drifted into a new kind of fame, the kind used to teach what not to do. Donors smiled politely and moved meetings to the foggy horizon. Consultants drafted memos titled "Risk Profile Heritage Without Discipline." A political science professor opened a seminar with a slide that read, "The arrogant air why entitlement makes weak strategists," and no one asked whom it referenced. Corporate trainers added a final page to their workshops, a simple triangle with 3 words at the corners: power, impulse, liability, and the case positioned at the center. In every retelling, the warning grew clearer. Bloodlines can build a platform, but they cannot build judgment, and they never build immunity. The price of inherited arrogance, once abstract, now had a clean number beside it. From op-eds to dinner tables, the wider lesson condensed into plain truth that even children could repeat without stumbling. Justice does not discriminate by color or origin, people said, pointing to the verdict like a mile marker on a long road. Free speech does not equal the right to defame, they added, because debate is not a license to dehumanize, and the First Amendment is not a shield for malice. An ordinary woman can stand up and make a powerful dynasty bow before the truth parents told their kids, because titles do not trump evidence and microphones do not erase consequence. "Truth has value, and sometimes its price is $50 million, wrote a columnist who had watched the case from jury selection to judgment, signing off with the number as a period. The lessons did not require a law degree, only a sense of fairness any neighbor could recognize. And as the country repeated them, they stopped sounding like headlines and started sounding like rules. The verdict is written, now the work is ours. If this case moved, you move with it. Move now. Call your representatives and say, protect dignity, not slander. Share the ruling with 3 people who think their voice does not matter today. If you witness harassment, record it, report it, and stand next to the person targeted immediately. Tell your kids, your coworkers, your friends, truth has a price and we will pay it together publicly. Right now, make this a living moment, not just a headline. Subscribe for updates, hit the bell, and drop a comment with one action you will take this week. Share this video to one group chat, one timeline, and one workplace thread. Turn a clip into a community. Donate to a local legal aid or civil rights clinic if you can, and if you cannot, volunteer an hour. Keep your words sharp but human. Argue the point, never the person. Say it out loud with me. We are not lesser and the law knows our names. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.